Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's lecture, The Cyrus Cylinder, the Discovery and Creation of an Icon, and our lecturer, John Curtis. It's actually only 7 short weeks ago that John was with us to open the exhibition, The Cyrus Cylinder and Ancient Persia, A New Beginning. And so we're delighted to see him back here as we close the exhibition this weekend. So, The Cyrus Cylinder and Ancient Persia, A New Beginning, this exhibition has been a phenomenal success. I think we've had some wonderful critical reviews. Visitors, too, have enjoyed it. Our opening weekend was a media frenzy. I use that politely because it was actually wild. And featured an interview with Neil McGregor, the director of the British Museum, and CNN's Christiane Amanpour, and you can actually see that on her website. In a relatively short time, it's only been a 7-week showing, we've welcomed more than 140,000 visitors to the exhibition. We've also had over 400 media outlets around the world pick up this feature. 1.37 billion media impressions. It's really a quite phenomenal number. And when we held our Nowruz celebration, there were 10,000 people who came for that, and so it seemed 10,000 in the exhibition. So there were long lines to see the cylinder on its North American debut. I'm absolutely thrilled because actually what I see is not just numbers. I see an extraordinary concentration. The visitors are really attending to this exhibition in a marvelous way. And it shows really the inverse of what one would expect. So many of us do large, sprawling exhibitions where I think people flag at certain times. And here, almost a single object exhibition has captured people's attention in a manner in which is really unexpected. And Neil McGregor and I would really like to see whether we could actually take this formula and repeat it with some other objects. Tomorrow, there's going to be a symposium on the Cyrus and the Cyrus Cylinder. And I'd like to say that the symposium, and indeed tonight's talk, have been only made possible through the generous support from the Foundation for Iranian Studies, from the Leon Levy Foundation, and from the Iran Heritage Foundation. Tomorrow's symposium, so many thanks to those funders, really very, very generous. Tomorrow's symposium, for which tonight's talk is really the keynote lecture, begins actually with a coffee session in the Freer Courtyard at 9:30, so please feel free to come to that. And then please attend the symposium, which will tell us more about Cyrus's achievements and the perception of Cyrus in subsequent eras. Tonight's lecture by John Curtis is one that we're really welcoming because John is keeper of special Middle East projects at the British Museum. He's the curator of the Cyrus Cylinder exhibition. And a few words about his career. He began his career at the British Museum in 1971 when he was appointed as a research assistant in what eventually became the Middle East Department. He became keeper of that department in 1989, and from his vantage point in the British Museum, he's had a huge impact on the field of ancient Near Eastern art. And he's also directed excavations, particularly in the 1980s, on behalf of the British Museum at 8 different sites in Iraq, including Nimrud and Balawat. Within the museum, he's overseen the installation of 6 new permanent galleries and curated numerous exhibitions. Amongst these are, that's probably the cuneiform app I was talking about. Among these are the traveling exhibition, Art and Empire, Treasures from Assyria in the British Museum. That's an exhibition that's been sent to 9 venues worldwide. And also an exhibition called Forgotten Empire, The World of Ancient Persia, which was held in the British Museum between September 2005 and June 2006. A marvelous exhibition that attracted some 155,000 visitors. Through his publications, he's the author of and editor of 14 books and over 100 articles. John Curtis has reached several generations of students and scholars. He's a fellow of the British Academy, and in 2006, his services to the field were recognized when he was given the Order of the British Empire. He's been deeply involved in efforts to protect the cultural heritage of Iraq in particular. And he is, of course, as I said, the author of the Cyrus Cylinder catalogue, a book that I hope is still available in our shops because it's been flying out. So please join me in welcoming John Curtis.
Well, thank you, Julian, for those very kind words, and thank you and Nancy Micklewright and Massimo Farhad for inviting me here to Washington to give this lecture. And after the very impressive statistics that Julian quoted about the exhibition, I feel this lecture may be a bit of a letdown, but I hope not. Well, let us start by describing the Cyrus Cylinder. It's a barrel-shaped cylinder which is inscribed in the Babylonian language in Babylonian cuneiform, cuneiform meaning wedge-shaped characters, and it was written after the Persian king Cyrus the Great captured Babylon in 539 BC, and it was buried as a foundation deposit. And it was actually customary for the preceding Assyrian and Babylonian kings to bury inscribed clay cylinders of this kind under new buildings as foundation deposits, so Cyrus here was following an ancient tradition. Well, before examining how the cylinder was found, or what I says, let's briefly put Cyrus himself into a historical context. We don't know much actually about his early career, and what little we do know comes largely from classical sources such as the Greek historian Herodotus. I'm just wondering, this probably is a pointer, and I must be sure not to direct it at anybody. Oh, I've got it, yeah, okay. He was apparently the king of Anshan in Persia. This is the place which is marked here as Teli Malian. And in 550 BC, he defeated in battle his maternal grandfather, who was the king of the Medes. So in this way, he brought together the two related tribes of Medes and Persians. And the date of 550 BC is usually taken as the start of the Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid period, it is sometimes called, after the eponymous founder of the dynasty, Achaemenes. Well, after he'd established control over Iran, Cyrus was drawn into a conflict with King Croesus of Lydia. There's Lydia over there, and in western Turkey. And Croesus was defeated in about 547 BC, which brought most of modern Turkey under the control of Cyrus. He now turned his attention to Babylon. Babylon's just it's not marked on this map, more or less where it says Babylonia, which since the overthrow of Assyria in 612 had ruled supreme in most of the ancient Near East, reaching its zenith under the renowned king Nebuchadnezzar. But more recently, Babylon had been in decline under the king Nabonidus, who was more concerned with pursuing his own religious interests than in ruling Babylon. And for a period of 10 years, he'd even moved to Tamar in Saudi Arabia, modern Saudi Arabia that is, where he dedicated a temple to the moon god Sin, leaving behind in Babylon his son Belshazzar as the regent. So in 539, Cyrus moved against Babylon and, according to his own account, was able to capture the city peacefully. Possession of Babylon brought the whole area as far as the Mediterranean coast over there under the control of Cyrus. So already in the reign of Cyrus, the Persian Empire stretched from Central Asia, somewhere up here, right across to the Mediterranean. And, the empire actually reached its greatest extent under Darius, when it stretched from Egypt in the west, from North Africa, right across to the Indus Valley in the east. Well, probably towards the end of his life, Cyrus established a new center at Pasargadae in southwestern Iran, and after his death in 530 BC, he was buried there at Pasargadae in a splendid gabled tomb. Well, to return to the cylinder, it was found, as I say, at Babylon, which is up just there, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. This was in 1879, and it was found during excavations supervised by Hormuz Rassam on behalf of the British Museum. And because he had a firman from the Ottoman government signed by the Sultan in Istanbul, he was allowed to export any antiquities found back to the British Museum. Well, the cylinder was found between February and March 1879, at a time when Rassam was not actually at the site. With regard to the exact location or find spot, in a letter to Samuel Birch, keeper of the Department of Oriental Antiquities at the British Museum, Rassam wrote, "The cylinder of Cyrus was found at Omran, with about 600 pieces of inscribed terracottas, that is, cuneiform tablets." Now, Omran refers to the mound of Omran ibn Ali, which is marked on a number of old maps of Babylon. Here it is down here. It's called the Amran Mounds. Nearly 20 years later, in his book Ashur and the Land of Nimrod, that's in 1897, Rassam wrote that the cylinder was found in the ruins of Jimjima. This is the name of a village, meaning skull in Arabic, the location of which is marked rather indiscriminately on different maps. However, the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, who excavated at Babylon between 1899 and 1917, published this map, which marks Jimjima down here in the area marked DD, and as you'll see, that's actually at the south end of the mound of Amran. So the two locations given by Rassam are not necessarily in conflict with each other. Well, let's look now at the evidence from the cylinder itself. If it was indeed wholly or partially a building deposit, foundation deposit, the building or feature under which it was buried should be mentioned in the text. And this is what Cyrus says: "I strove to strengthen the defenses of the wall Imgur Enlil, the great wall of Babylon, and I completed the quay of baked bricks on the bank of the moat, which an earlier king had built but not completed." In fact, Imgur Enlil was a name given to the inner city wall of Babylon, which ran just to the south of the Imran ibn Ali mound. You can actually see it there. This is the inner city wall. The quay wall would also have been close to this location, bearing in mind that the ancient bed of the river Euphrates came actually down here. This is its modern course over to the west. So it's likely that a fine spot at the south or southwest end of the Amran Mound could have been under the inner city wall, or indeed under there's the inner city wall coming there, or indeed under the quay wall, or most likely of all at the junction of the two walls, which would have been just about there. I'd like to say very briefly a few words about Babylon. Of course, the site nowadays is probably best known for this splendid monument called the Ishtar Gate, which is now in the museum in Berlin. On the site itself, the Lion of Babylon is probably the best preserved monument. There's not actually a very great deal else to see, but one of the palaces built by Nebuchadnezzar, this is the so-called Southern Palace, was extensively restored in the time of Saddam Hussein. Now, you may well remember that in 2003-04, Babylon hit the world's headlines because a military camp was established by the coalition right in the middle of the ancient city. Here's the ancient city, and this is the location of the military camp. And unfortunately, in that process, some damage was done to the site. Long trenches, for example, were dug through previously undisturbed archaeological deposits, and not surprisingly, large numbers of antiquities were thrown up in the process. There's also some damage to the foundations. These are the foundations of the Ishtar Gate, of which I've showed you the top upper glazed part, which is in Berlin. And lastly, some of the restored monuments. This is the Ishtar Temple, largely because of neglect, actually, over quite a long period, started to fall to pieces. But now I'm happy to say that the World Monuments Fund, based in New York, actually, has been entrusted with the task of preparing a management plan for Babylon. They've been working on this already for 2 or 3 years, and they are making remarkable progress. This is one of the charts that they've produced, very detailed work showing land ownership divisions on the site of Babylon itself. So the story does, to some extent, have a happy ending. Well, to go back to the cylinder, the text of the cylinder is written in parallel lines extending from one end of it to the other, and all or parts of 45 lines are preserved, while about 20 or more are completely missing. And the missing parts include portions of some lines at the beginning and the end of the text. The cylinder evidently was written by a Babylonian scribe who was familiar with the Babylonian textual and literary traditions. The style is certainly Babylonian, and some sentences recall earlier texts of the Neo-Babylonian period. However, the scribe may have been putting in a Babylonian format content that was determined by the new Persian overlords. So what does the cylinder actually say? It records that Nabonidus had neglected the sanctuaries of various gods and had shown lack of respect for Marduk, king of the gods. We read, this is Nabonidus, did yet more evil to his city every day. Individual gods were angry that they, or statues of them, had been brought to Babylon. It goes on, the population of the land of Sumer and Akkad, the population had become like corpses. As a result, Marduk looked for the upright king of his choice and chose Cyrus. He took the hand of Cyrus, king of the city of Anshan, and called him by his name, proclaiming him aloud for the kingship over all of everything. And Cyrus was ordered by Marduk to go to Babylon, and with the assistance of Marduk, he entered Babylon without fighting or battle, is what it says. The text then switches to the first person as if Cyrus himself is actually speaking. I'm Cyrus, king of the universe, the great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four quarters of the world, etc. He says his troops marched peaceably in Babylon and that he freed the people of Babylon from their forced labor obligations. These are presumed to have been imposed on the population during the previous regime. He boasts that kings from every quarter, from the upper sea to the lower sea, brought tribute to him in Babylon and kissed his feet, and that he sent back gods, that is, statues of gods, to various sanctuaries which had become dilapidated and which he restored. He then says the places he mentioned are actually all in the vicinity of Babylonia or western Iran or Assyria. He then says, I collected together all their people, that's people from the sanctuaries, and returned them to their settlements. And he arranged for offerings to be supplied to the restored shrines, and then talks about the restoration of the walls of Babylon that we've already described. And in the course of his building projects, he says he came across a foundation inscription of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. Well, we come on now to the crucial question, what is the real significance of the Cyrus Cylinder? Is it, as its proponents would argue, some kind of declaration of human rights, or is it nothing more than a standard type of building inscription in the Assyrian and Babylonian tradition? To begin with, we should consider why the cylinder is marked out by some as a document of special significance. First, there's the claim that the conquest and occupation of Babylon was entirely peaceful. It's certainly true that there's no evidence of any kind of destruction level at Babylon at the beginning of the Persian period, and it's also the case that it was standard practice, both before and after the Achaemenid period, for conquerors to loot and burn captured cities. In this instance, then, Cyrus was departing from normal practice. Secondly, Cyrus claims, if this passage has been understood correctly, that he freed the inhabitants of Babylon from their forced labor obligations, which was presumably some kind of magnanimous act. Thirdly, and most important, we have the statement in lines 30 to 34 that Cyrus restored shrines in various places in Greater Mesopotamia and sent back to those shrines statues of gods that had presumably been brought to Babylon by the previous Babylonian kings. This statement is usually taken to mean that Cyrus is not only allowing but actively encouraging the worship of different gods in different places. He is, therefore, effectively promoting religious tolerance and freedom of worship, but to understand the significance of this, we need to view it in a contemporary 6th century BC context. We'll come back to this later. Fourthly, there's the statement that people from restored shrines were collected together and returned to their settlements, which is usually understood to refer to peoples who had been deported by the Babylonian kings. So, for these reasons, the cylinder is regarded by many people as a document confirming the impression given in the Bible and some classical authors, the impression of Cyrus as a champion of liberal and humanitarian values and a defender of human rights. On the other hand, skeptics argue that the Cyrus Cylinder is a foundation inscription of typical Babylonian type and doesn't depart from the traditional model either in terms of its shape or its content. They compare the Cyrus cylinder with barrel cylinders of the preceding Babylonian kings and argue that the cylinder is merely following standard Babylonian practice. Close parallels are also to be found with the foundation inscriptions of Assyrian kings, particularly Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. There are certainly similarities. Thus, in his clay prisms, recording the restoration of Babylon, Esarhaddon says that he's been instructed to do these good works by Marduk, and he describes the building works themselves. He says in one text Marduk ordered me to complete the cult centers, to renovate the shrines, and to organize well the rites of Esagil, the palace of the gods. And further on, I returned the plundered gods of the land from Assyria and the land Elam to their proper places, and I set up proper procedures in all of the cult centers. It appears then that Cyrus may have been following precedent when he sent statues of gods back to the shrines from which they'd been seized, as Esarhaddon also claims to have sent back god statues from Babylon to Assyria and Elam. However, the scale of the operation under Cyrus may have been much greater, given that he mentions more places than Esarhaddon. Also, it's reasonable to conclude that although the places referred to are restricted to Babylonia, Assyria, and Iran, they may also have included places to the west which are not mentioned because Cyrus was writing for a Babylonian audience. More remarkable than the list of places to which god statues were returned, however, is the statement that people were returned to their settlements, which does not seem to have been part of the usual rubric of Assyrian or Babylonian inscriptions. Therefore, we might tentatively conclude that the cylinder does show some evidence of a departure from the standard foundation inscription. That the cylinder's written in Babylonian style and using Babylonian phraseology is irrelevant, as we know that it was written by a Babylonian scribe in, of course, the Babylonian language. Well, in any consideration of the significance of the cylinder, a recent discovery of great importance, and this is the realization that two fragments in the British Museum belong to a cuneiform tablet with the same or part of the same inscription as the cylinder itself. These fragments were identified in the British Museum among a group of tablet fragments that were collected by Rassam, either in Babylon itself, which is the most likely, or in the nearby sites of Dilbat or Borsippa. The first fragment, that's the one on the left, was identified by the late Professor Wilfrid Lambert just before Christmas in 2009, while the second fragment was identified by my colleague Irving Finkel about 10 days later. Alerted to the Lambert discovery, Irving looked in the same collection for pieces of similar appearance and with, believe it or not, the same handwriting, and he struck gold. Now, it may seem strange to you that pieces are still being identified after they've been in the British Museum for more than 130 years. But it seems strange to me sometimes. But the fact is that in the collections there are about 500,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments. Now, all of these have, of course, been looked at, but many of the fragments are small, and their proper significance hasn't necessarily been recognized. And studying the tablet collection is ongoing work, and actually scholars come from all over the world, including from the United States, to work on the collection. Well, to come back to the new pieces, one of them, that's the one on the left, is one-sided, and not only duplicates lines 34 to 7 of the cylinder inscription, but adds some important information that was missing, namely that Cyrus and Cambyses, his son, will provide for the shrines of returned gods until distant days. The second piece, and what you see here on the right, is the front and is the back of it at the top, and the front of it at the bottom. So it's the same piece. This comes from the top edge of the tablet and has new material both from the beginning and the end of the inscription. And this piece presents a tribute and prayers to Marduk and includes the name of the scribe, Kishti Marduk, who wrote out or copied the tablet. So these two new fragments belong to a large cuneiform tablet that duplicating the text of the Cyrus cylinder. And they're of great significance because they show that the cylinder was not a unique document and that copies of it existed, certainly on clay tablets and perhaps in other mediums. Of course, it could be argued that the tablet was a draft or prototype for the cylinder inscription, or even some kind of file copy, but this seems unlikely, and it raises the possibility that the cylinder contained, perhaps only in part, the text of some kind of proclamation. There are precedents for Achaemenid kings issuing proclamations. So we know that versions of Darius's great rock-cut inscription at Bisatun, near Kermanshah in western Iran, were circulated around the empire. This inscription, incidentally, was in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. And in the Old Persian version, Darius says Darius the king, by the favor of Ahura Mazda, this is the inscription which I made, on clay tablets and on parchment it was composed, and it was inscribed and read off before me. Afterwards, this inscription I sent off everywhere amongst the provinces. The people unitedly worked upon it. We've also got the evidence of a stele found at Babylon, which, although in fragments, apparently reproduces on the reverse the Babylonian version or part of it of this Bisatun inscription. And there's even an Aramaic version of this Bisatun inscription found at Elephantine in Egypt. So it's by no means implausible that Cyrus issued a proclamation of the same kind. Well, we've cited 5 reasons why the Cyrus Cylinder might be viewed as an unusual and extraordinary document. These are the restitution of the god statues, the repatriation of deported peoples, the freeing of the people of Babylon from forced labor obligations, the peaceful occupation of Babylon, and the suggestion that the cylinder might have contained some sort of proclamation. Now, it is true that precedents for any of these acts might be found amongst the actions of earlier and even later kings, but I'm not aware of any other document which provides evidence for all 5 things together at the same time. Certainly, then, in my view, we're looking at a remarkable inscription. Well, let's see now how Cyrus was viewed by his contemporaries and near contemporaries. Firstly, there's much in Cyrus about the Bible. At the end of the second book of Chronicles, we're told that because of the wickedness of King Zedekiah, the Lord allowed Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to attack Jerusalem. He slaughtered many of the inhabitants, carried off to Babylon the temple treasures, burnt the temple, and deported to Babylon the inhabitants who had survived the massacre. What you see here is from the New International Version of the Bible. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the king moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you, may the Lord be with you, and let him go up. This story is then taken up in the first book of Ezra, which repeats the last 2 verses of 2 Chronicles, and goes on to say that Cyrus decrees that all Jews should return to Jerusalem to help in the rebuilding of the temple, both physically and financially. And Cyrus also returns to Jerusalem all the temple treasures that Nebuchadnezzar had removed to Babylon. And there's a further suggestion, as we've seen in the biblical account, that the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem was the subject of a proclamation. According to the book of Ezra, there had been little progress with the rebuilding of the temple by the reign of Darius, apparently for reasons of local politics, and the builders were asked to justify the project. So a letter was sent to Darius claiming that Cyrus had issued a decree ordering the temple to be rebuilt. Cyrus ordered a search to be made, and a scroll was found not in Babylon, as expected, but in the citadel of Ecbatana, that is, in modern Hamadan, recording that Cyrus issued a decree ordering that the temple should be rebuilt and paid for out of the royal purse. As a result, Darius ordered a new decree ordering the temple should be rebuilt. Well, this story probably shouldn't be taken at face value, but it is perhaps further evidence for the issuing of decrees and the storage of them. So the Bible tells us that Cyrus liberated the Jews from their Babylonian exile and sent them back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. As we've seen, the Cyrus Cylinder doesn't mention Judah or the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, but it is concerned, we must remember, with events in Greater Mesopotamia. Given that it refers to the restoration of shrines and the repatriation of deported peoples, it seems entirely reasonable to connect the biblical story with the account in the Cylinder. And for the Jews, the return to Jerusalem and the building of the Second Temple were clearly momentous events, and this is reflected by the view of Cyrus in the book of Isaiah, where he's referred to as the Lord's shepherd and to his anointed one, literally his Messiah. We've also got the testimony of classical authors. Herodotus of the 5th century BC greatly admired Cyrus, and Xenophon made him the subject of a novel or political romance called Cyropedia. And this book's based on the life of Cyrus, but it's partially fictional and presents him as an ideal ruler. But it's a measure of the impact that this book has had that Cyropedia is said to have been required reading alongside Machiavelli's The Prince for some of the founding fathers of the United States. And Thomas Jefferson actually had 2 copies of this book, one of which is in the exhibition. Given the intrinsic evidence from the Cylinder itself and how Cyrus and his actions were viewed by his contemporaries, I think it must be acknowledged that the man himself was an enlightened, if not benevolent ruler. It seems also clear that the Cylinder is more than a standard Babylonian building inscription, although we must certainly stop short of regarding it as some kind of statement about human rights. This latter idea has usually arisen because of Cyrus's statement in the Cylinder that he returned God statues to their sanctuaries, thereby allowing local cults to flourish. And this is often seen as a deliberate policy of religious toleration, but it needs to be viewed in the context of the 6th century BC. In fact, there had never been, in the preceding Assyrian and Babylonian periods, any attempt to impose a religion on conquered peoples. And although God statues were brought to Babylon and their sanctuaries allowed to fall into disrepair, for example, in the Babylonian period, it doesn't mean that the religions themselves were being suppressed. And the concept of a state religion that needed to be carried abroad didn't exist at all at this time and wasn't to do so in Iran until the Smithsonian period, about 800 years after the time of Cyrus. Well, as so much of the discussion about Cyrus is centered on his so-called religious policy, let's ask now what we know about his own religious beliefs. I'm afraid the answer is we don't know very much. Achaemenid kings from Darius onwards paid tribute in their inscriptions to Ahura Mazda and should most properly be described as worshippers of Ahura Mazda or Mazda worshippers. We don't know if they were Zoroastrians in the sense that they were aware of and followed the teachings of the prophet Zarathustra, known as Zoroaster in Greek, who reformed the ancient Iranian religion with its belief in the supreme god Ahura Mazda. But although this evidence is lacking for Cyrus, many scholars, particularly Iranologists, are convinced that he also would have been a believer in Ahura Mazda. This, incidentally, is a gold plaque which is in the exhibition. It comes from the Oxus treasure. It's usually thought to show a priest. He may have been a Zoroastrian priest, but this piece dates from a period about 150 years after the time of Cyrus. Well, although the Persian kings were followers of Ahura Mazda, it doesn't mean that they did not respect other deities. Thus, we know from the Persepolis fortification tablets written in the time of Darius that official funds were set aside for providing rations such as cereals, wine, or animals for religious ceremonies, honoring a variety of Elamite, Babylonian, and even Iranian gods. Then in the cylinder itself, we see that Cyrus acts in accordance with the wishes of the Babylonian god Marduk, whom he calls my lord. He also asks that the gods whom he returns to their shrines should intercede on his behalf with Marduk and Nabu. In other words, Cyrus supports, in other contexts, he supports different gods. He also undertook restoration work at the site of Waka in southern Mesopotamia, where there was a sanctuary of Ishtar, and he was also active at Ur, where there was a sanctuary of Sin, the Babylonian moon god. And this brick, which is in the exhibition, comes from Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur, and shows that Cyrus was active at that site. Then in the Bible, Cyrus says, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. That's in 2 Chronicles. But it's interesting that in the book of Isaiah, it's twice recorded that Cyrus does not acknowledge the supremacy of the God of Israel, which must be an honor that he gives to another God. So we read, this is the Lord God of Israel speaking, I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me, and I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me. The explanation for this is that it was customary at that time for kings to respect other people's gods and even to recognize that they had authority in their own countries. For this reason, it was obligatory for Cyrus to pay respect to Marduk when he entered Babylon, but this doesn't mean that he revered Marduk above all other gods. We've seen the same situation in the Bible, and this is entirely in accord with prevailing contemporary views. Gods had a national identity with authority over their own people and were not perceived as the only gods who existed. So in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, Yahweh is presented as God of the Israelites, not as the only God who prevails over the whole world. So Cyrus lived in a pluralistic world where it was customary to pay tribute to a number of gods, even if your main allegiance was to a single national god. To return to the cylinder, by returning the god statues, Cyrus was sending a signal that he was happy for the status quo to continue. This particular action should be interpreted then not so much as religious tolerance, but as political pragmatism. The same motivation may have underpinned many of his other actions. In the space of just 11 years, Cyrus was confronted with the problem of how to control the First World Empire. He chose to do so, it seems, by compromise rather than confrontation. And for this, he earned the admiration of his contemporaries, and his cylinder is a remarkably enlightened and, to some extent, progressive record. Well, I want to come on now to the creation of an icon. After its arrival in the British Museum in 1879, the cylinder was translated by Theophilus Pinches, he's shown here on the left, and a description of it was given by Sir Henry Creswick Rawlinson to the Royal Asiatic Society just a month later, followed by a publication in the Society's journal the next year. And since then, there have been a number of translations, the most recent of which, and I think the most authoritative and the one from which I've been quoting, is that made by my colleague Dr. Irving Finkel. The significance of the cylinder as an important historical document was actually realized immediately upon its discovery, but there was no thought at that time that the cylinder had special connotations for human rights or freedom of expression, and there was no hint of the notoriety that the cylinder was later to acquire. In Rassam's own account of his excavations at Babylon, his 1897 account, he refers to the Cyrus cylinder disparagingly as a broken terracotta cylinder, which contained the official record of the taking of Babylon by Cyrus. Then in the British Museum Guidebook for 1922, the cylinder is described rather dryly as a portion of a baked clay cylinder of Cyrus, king of Babylon. The first edition of the Cambridge Ancient History, published in 1926, refers only to the cylinder inscription, and that's in a footnote. And in the 14th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica in 1929, the article on Cyrus the Great simply refers to the cylinder containing his proclamation to the Babylonians. Well, thus matters stood until the 1960s, when the phrases First Bill of Human Rights or First Declaration of Human Rights seem first to have been coined, but exactly by who is not quite clear. However, by 1967, in his book The White Revolution of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was calling the cylinder the world's first declaration of human rights, and this claim was repeated in 1968 when he opened the first United Nations Conference on Human Rights in Tehran and referred to the Cyrus Cylinder as the precursor to the modern Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then, as many of you know, in 1971, the Cyrus Cylinder was made the official symbol of the celebrations held to mark the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire by Cyrus the Great, to give it its official title. The idea of this celebration had been formally proposed in 1958, apparently by Dr. Shuja'uddin Shafar, an Iranian diplomat who was also cultural advisor to the Shah. Initially, the celebration was planned for 1961, that is 2,500 years after Cyrus's capture of Babylon in 539, but it was subsequently postponed twice. Well, when it did eventually take place, in October 1971, from the 12th to the 16th, the celebration was an extravaganza on an unprecedented scale and made the Shah deeply unpopular with his own subjects and an object of ridicule worldwide. A large tent city was built near Persepolis to accommodate the 600 guests from around the world, including members of royal families and large numbers of presidents and prime ministers. The USA was presented by Vice President Spiro Agnew, and Britain by the Duke of Edinburgh and Princess Anne. The festivities lasted for 4 days and included a gala dinner with food supplied by Maxim's in Paris, and a military parade with soldiers dressed in historical costumes representing Iran's glorious past. Then on the last day of the celebrations, the Shah inaugurated the Shahid Tower, now renamed the Azadi, or Freedom Tower, in Tehran, that was built specially to commemorate the 2,500-year celebrations. And in the base of this tower was a museum where the Cyrus Cylinder, loaned by the British Museum, was briefly on display for just 4 days. And as noted by Martin Bailey of the Art newspaper, the Shah used the presence of the Cyrus Cylinder to argue that Persia had been the birthplace of human rights, although the Shah's own record in this respect fell somewhat short of the ideals thought to be embodied in the cylinder. Well, as we've said, the cylinder became the official symbol of the celebrations, and a logo was produced showing the cylinder surrounded by a garland of lotus flowers in Persepolitan style and surmounted by the imperial coat of arms of Iran. Then a set of 4 stamps commemorating the anniversary was issued, one of them showing the Cyrus Cylinder. Beneath the cylinder is written, actually in French, Proclamation of Cyrus the Great. And the Cyrus Cylinder also appeared on medals, and as a silver medal at the top, and on coins. This is a silver proof coin, and here is a gold one. Also at this time, the Shah's sister, Princess Ashraf, presented UN Secretary General U Thant with a replica of the cylinder and since then it's been on display in the UN headquarters in New York, translated into all 6 official UN languages. Then, apart from Iran, stamps commemorating the 2,500th year anniversary were issued by a number of countries on good terms with Iran, and underpinning its by now iconic status, the cylinder was shown on stamps of Ethiopia, Romania, Ajman, Oman, and al-Gawain. Back in Iran, in the time of the monarchy still, the cylinder was shown again on a stamp commemorating the 22nd International Red Cross Conference held in Tehran in 1973, and the claims for the cylinder were now even more outlandish. Beneath the cylinder was written in French, "Inscribed on this cylinder 2,500 years ago was the proclamation of Cyrus the Great that gave birth to the principles of the Red Cross." Well, it's interesting that reverence for the cylinder has outlasted the monarchy that promoted it in the first place. It became an Iranian icon during the time of the Iranian monarchy, and rather surprisingly, it's also been adopted as an icon by the Islamic Republic. So the cylinder appeared again on a stamp issued in 2005 to commemorate Expo 2005, the exhibition that was held in Japan. And again, we find the cylinder being described on the stamp as the first World Charter of Human Rights. Well, even before this, officials of the Islamic Republic had asked in 2003 if they could borrow the cylinder when the loan of objects from Iran to the British Museum exhibition Forgotten Empire that Julian Raby referred to was being first discussed. But I have to say the loan of the cylinder was never a condition of our borrowing objects from Tehran. But the British Museum was happy to agree in principle to the loan, partly in recognition of the generosity of the Iranians in lending objects to the Forgotten Empire exhibition and another later exhibition on Shah Abbas. It was also recognized that the loan of the cylinder would facilitate the continuation of cultural contacts at a time when political relations were tense. So eventually it was agreed that the cylinder could be loaned for the period January to May 2010, but 2 things conspired to stop this from happening. First, in December 2009, there were anti-government riots in Tehran. And secondly, by coincidence, at exactly the same time, in fact, the 2 small tablet fragments that I've referred to were identified as belonging to a cuneiform tablet with part of the same inscription as the cylinder. So faced with these 2 facts, what seemed to be escalating violence in Tehran, an important academic discovery that required urgent verification, the museum took the decision to postpone the loan until normality had been restored in Tehran and to use the opportunity to organize an academic seminar about the new discoveries. And it has to be said, this decision was unpopular in Tehran, but channels of communications were kept open and hopes were expressed on each side that the loan might go ahead. Here, the seminar was in due course held in 2010, and experts attended from all around the world, including the USA, Germany, and China. And by the late summer of 2010, the British Museum felt the situation had sufficiently stabilized for the loan to be reactivated. And dates of September 2010 to January 2011 were agreed for the exhibition. Well, the cylinder and the 2 tablet fragments were exhibited in a square freestanding case that was sent specially out on loan from the British Museum. As you see, it was put in the middle of a large room on the upper floor of the museum, and a low glass wall around the case prevented crowds from getting too close to it. And around the walls of the room were 11 explanatory panels in Persian describing the cylinder, its discovery, and its significance. And the texts with illustrations had all been sent out from London. And outside the exhibition hall, the entire upper floor of the museum had been given over to a recreation of Persepolis in photographs and casts. Well, I have to say the whole exhibition was designed with taste and flair and was a remarkable demonstration of how an entire exhibition can be made from a single object if that object is powerful enough. And the visitor experience even extended to the outside of the museum, and in the forecourt were banners and an ice cream parlor and 2 souvenir stalls selling mugs, replicas, posters, and other memorabilia. But on a serious note, I'd like to stress here that all the didactic material was written and translated into Persian in the British Museum, as was the official Persian catalogue that accompanied the exhibition. There was no attempt whatsoever to modify or change any of the text, so in no way at all was the cylinder misrepresented in the exhibition. There was no reference to its being the first declaration of human rights or anything like that, and the cylinder was presented actually in much the same way I'm describing it now in this lecture. Well, the opening ceremony on Sunday, 12th September 2010 was attended by the President of Iran, Mr. Ahmadinejad, Mr. Mashai, the advisor to the President, Mr. Baghai, the head of the Iranian Cultural Heritage Organization, Neil McGregor, the director of the British Museum, and Vesta Sarkosh and myself. As you see, we all stood in a line in front of the case with photographers all massed on the other side. And the case itself was hidden initially by a sort of cover made from the Iranian flag, and as everybody watched, this cover was drawn upwards by a cord, revealing to great applause the cylinder inside the case. Well, after this, there was a ceremony in the auditorium of the Islamic Museum. The stage was decorated in Persepolitan style with reconstructed friezes and relief decoration. And on the right of the stage was a huge replica of the Cyrus Cylinder. And you can see it here looking something like a gigantic watermelon. Well, predictably, the Iranian speeches all referred to the values of peace, goodness, justice, freedom, and liberty thought to be embodied by the cylinder, but interestingly it was presented not so much as a document of human rights, but as a symbol of Iranian nationalism. And this theme of protecting Iran was taken up in a performance featuring a succession of actors playing the parts of Cyrus the Great, of Kaveh Ahangar, the blacksmith of the Shahnameh, the Iranian national epic by Ferdowsi, who rescued Iran from the usurper Zahak, and lastly a martyr, a Basiji, with the flag of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who repelled invaders in the Iraq-Iran war. So the great success of the exhibition led the Iranians to ask for an extension until April of 2011, so the cylinder could be kept in Tehran for the Nowruz holiday, which was agreed to. And at the closing ceremony, Mr. Mashai regretted the cylinder was about to leave Iran, but he applauded the principle that it should be exhibited in as many countries as possible to give more people the chance to see it. And it should be noted here that contrary to the predictions of some skeptics before the exhibition, there was no attempt whatsoever by the Iranian government to impede the return of the cylinder or to delay it in any way. And although at least one radical newspaper suggested at the start of the tour that it should be impounded, this demand was soon dropped. So the National Museum proved, as expected, to be a considerate and reliable partner, and the Iranian colleagues were a pleasure to work with. Well, the exhibition in Tehran was extremely popular, but estimates of the total number of visitors have varied somewhat. The official figure is just over 1 million, but based on the available evidence, I think a figure up to 500,000 is more likely. And the exhibition is commemorated in an alcove just outside the main door of the museum, and a new high-quality replica of the cylinder has been placed on a bed of sand at the bottom of the alcove, which has been sealed with a glass panel, and behind it on the wall is a brass plaque, as you can see, inscribed in Persian and in English. Well, evidently, the cylinder has come to acquire a special resonance for Iranians, and it's now celebrated as a national symbol. There may be some who seek to disparage this by pointing out that the cylinder was found in Iraq, or that it does not espouse the values often attributed to it. But at the end of the day, it's not for us, I think, to pontificate about what objects or symbols countries should choose as their national icons. If nothing else, the cylinder is one of the few important objects associated with Cyrus, and Iranians can feel justly proud of the achievements of the founder of the Persian Empire. I'd like to conclude by saying that, as we've seen, the Cyrus cylinder is not the first declaration of human rights. It was never intended to be anything of the kind, and indeed, the concept of human rights didn't even exist at that time. However, as I've attempted to show this evening, it is a very remarkable document, and taken as a whole, the contents of the cylinder do demonstrate some break with past tradition and the ushering in of a new era. Thank you very much indeed.
Dr. Curtis has kindly agreed to answer some questions. We have a little bit of time, so does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? Sir, in the third row.
What is involved in the rules of ownership of something like this? You say it was found in Iraq, and I would assume there's some contest over who really owns that. And what are the rules? Who sets the rules of who actually owns something like this?
So I'll just repeat the question so everyone can hear, and it concerns the rules of ownership for an object such as this, which was found in Iraq and is now in the British Museum.
Well, of course, it's a very complicated matter, the whole question of cultural ownership. Very complicated indeed, and it applies to a whole range of things. In this particular case, it was found in Babylon when Babylon was part of the Ottoman Empire, and authority to export it to the British Museum was given by the authorities of the Ottoman Empire. That's why it's in the British Museum, and I think actually legally it would be very difficult to challenge that, given that at the time it was exported with all proper legal authority. That's the situation with that piece. But we can't now go into the whole question of cultural ownership, which involves a lot of other considerations, ethical as well as legal.
Sir.
Yes, what is the best example of statues that were returned based on the proclamation in the cylinder?
Sorry, the best example of?
The question is, what is the best example of some of the statues that could have been returned according to the directions in the cylinder?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are no, I think it's true to say, there probably aren't any surviving statues of this kind, but what we can see on Assyrian reliefs, these are the stone reliefs from the palaces of Assyrian kings, we can see Assyrians actually carrying god statues. You know, they're sort of mounted on a beam, and they're being carried by soldiers and taken away from captured cities. So as far as we can tell from those kinds of representations, they're about life size, and generally speaking, they've got, they've got human characteristics.
What would be an example of something I can see an image in a book or?
Sorry, what?
Image in a book.
Of these God statues you're talking about.
Of I've just been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are some books on Assyrian art. There's one called Assyrian Palace Reliefs in the British Museum, and I think it shows some of these god statues. Yeah.
Sir.
About the return of statues, the refounding of temples, and the repatriation of peoples, you've already said that magnanimity isn't necessarily the explanation for it. Could you elaborate a bit on what the self-interest and motives could be from the perspective of administering and ruling an empire?
So the question is, apart from the motivation of magnanimity in returning, in directing people to be returned to their home countries, what were the political kind of self-interests of Cyrus that might have motivated this decision?
Well, as I said, in the space of just 11 years, he came to power, as it were, in 550 BC. He captured Babylon in 539 BC, which is just 11 years later. And in that short time, he had to come to terms with how to rule the largest empire that the world, by far the largest empire that the world had seen up until that time, extending from the Aral Sea in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. So he had to come up with some policies that would actually work. And the previous policies of the Assyrian and Babylonian kings of, burning places to the ground, visiting them once a year to exact tribute, that sort of thing, weren't going to work. So he had to be a bit more pragmatic than that and come up with things that were going to meet with the approval, for example, of the inhabitants of Babylon and win their support. So I think you need to see the cylinder in that sort of light.
Back there, sir. Yeah.
Does the writing go all the way around the cylinder, and what percentage of the writing is extant and what is legible?
Yeah, the writing does go all around the cylinder. So the cylinder, as it were, is like that, and you read it by turning it round in that sort of a way. So if you go and look at the cylinder in the exhibition, for example, if you look at it this way, the writing will all be the right way up. If you go round to the back, the writing will be upside down. It'll only become the right way up when you turn the cylinder around like that. So it's sort of interesting sort of a concept, really.
And the percentage?
Yeah, and you also asked how much of it is lost, I think, didn't you? It's about 1/3 of the cylinder, which is not there.
In the back.
A little unclear about this, the tradition of placing something like this inside the foundation of a building. So who is the audience for this? If nobody's going to see it, if it's going to be stuck in the building, is it like a time capsule? What does it tell you about the purpose of this?
Yes. Well, we'll just repeat it maybe for some people.
The question is, who is the audience for an object that's going to be buried in a building foundation? Is it like a time capsule?
Yeah, well, in fact, these kinds of cylinders were put not just under buildings, but also structures. And as I've suggested, this one was buried under two walls, which actually came together. Usually, these cylinders like this, especially when they're buried by Babylonian and Assyrian kings, are only for the eyes of the gods, not for anybody else, or for people who come along later and might dig them up. But in this case, it seems that the document, or part of it, was intended for a wider audience because, as I've said, there's evidence that this was more than just a cylinder, that it was actually also a proclamation.
Gentleman in the white shirt there.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for coming. It is a great honor for us to have you. The honor's all mine, sir.
My question is, and I guess it's related to what was already asked, but could you comment a little bit more on how the cylinder has been restored, how many fragments there originally were, and what happened to make it appear as it appears today?
Yeah. Well, you see from this picture that it's actually in pieces. It seems that it was broken either accidentally or deliberately after it was found. It might have been broken deliberately because at that time, 1879, the workmen on these excavations were operating within a system of bakshish. In other words, they got special payments for objects that they found. So if you find something important and break it into 5 pieces, you might get paid 5 times as much as you would if it was in 1 piece. So it's thought that that's why it's broken in this kind of a way, and it's very sad that a third of it now is still missing. It may be found in some collection or another. We don't know.
Since the fragments of the tablets or the plaques that are in the exhibit indicate that Cyrus had the text of the cylinder copied and then distributed over a wide area, have there been any similar fragments excavated within Greater Babylonia that are currently in other museums around the world?
No, not yet. There haven't. No, they may yet be discovered in Babylon or in other places. In fact, I think they probably will, but they haven't been as yet. No.
Lady in the back.
Thank you for the lecture. I thought it was very informative. What I wanted to ask you is why, let's say, the idea of human rights, as you have suggested, is a very new idea. And yet, looking at Cyrus's career and some of the things you've mentioned about how his ideas were novel, even if they were politically motivated by the standards of the world until that time, it does imply that he was very humane, as you have mentioned, and why not let's say, let us give him the credit of saying, yes, he was somebody who appreciated human worth. I mean, after all, human rights is not being appreciated throughout the world today. So, I mean, what is the harm of saying, yes, this
Could you just summarize that?
today human rights? Anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
The question, I'm not sure there's really a question there. The statement was, what is given Cyrus's role as you've described it, and the fact that he was in many ways extraordinary for his time in the way that you have talked about, what's the harm in giving him this recognition that he did have an interest beyond the norm in that period in human rights? Even though the concept of human rights as we know it did not exist then.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that I took anything away from him at all. All I said was that we shouldn't call the cylinder a declaration of human rights. I mean, there's some extraordinary claims being made by people, sometimes based on erroneous translations of the cylinder. So I think it's right to say it's a very extraordinary document. He was a very extraordinary monarch. He was very unusual for his time. This definitely represents a break with past tradition. It's all of those things. I would just stop short of describing it as a first declaration of human rights.
And I think that's a very nice place to stop. So please join me again. And thank you.